High in the wilderness, a lone traveler crosses paths with a formidable mountain woman, feared for her strength and independence. When he falters under her piercing gaze, she smirks and says, "I can taste your fear, man." Instead of turning away, she pulls him into her arms, sparking a clash of power, passion, and vulnerability. What begins as intimidation becomes a bond, neither expected, proving that sometimes love in the wild is as raw and untamed as the mountains themselves. ELENA REDHAWK stands 6 feet tall in her worn leather boots, her dark hair braided with beads that catch the morning light filtering through the pine canopy. She has lived alone in these mountains for 7 years, earning a reputation among local hunters and hikers as someone to avoid. But when James Mitchell stumbles into her territory, bleeding and desperate, something shifts in the careful balance she has maintained. What happens when 2 wounded souls collide in the place where civilization ends? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blood on James Mitchell's shirt had dried to a rust-brown stain that matched the autumn leaves scattered across the forest floor. His grandfather's silver compass lay beside him, its glass face spiderwebbed with cracks, but the needle still trembling toward magnetic north. ELENA knelt beside the unconscious man, her calloused fingers checking his pulse with the efficiency of someone who had learned field medicine the hard way. 3 days ago, James had been sitting in a Manhattan boardroom, wearing a $2,000 suit and explaining quarterly projections to investors who hung on his every word. Now he lay broken in the wilderness, his expensive leather shoes split at the seams, his face pale beneath a week's worth of stubble. The irony wasn't lost on him as consciousness flickered back in waves of pain and disorientation. "Easy there, city boy," ELENA's voice cut through the fog in his mind. "You've lost enough blood to paint a barn." James tried to sit up, but her hand pressed firmly against his chest, keeping him flat against the makeshift bed she'd constructed from pine boughs and her own wool blanket. The cabin around him was smaller than his Manhattan bathroom, built from hand-hewn logs that still bore the marks of an axe. Shelves lined the walls, filled with mason jars containing dried herbs, preserved foods, and liquids he couldn't identify. "Where am I?" His voice came out as a croak, throat raw from dehydration. "My place, 23 miles from the nearest road, 47 from the nearest town." ELENA moved to the wood stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pot that smelled of wild game and unfamiliar spices. "You want to tell me why you were stumbling through bear country in dress shoes, or should I just assume you're running from something that scares you more than dying in the woods?" The question hit too close to home. James closed his eyes, remembering the moment his world had collapsed. He discovered the falsified environmental reports, the bribes to federal inspectors, the toxic waste his company had been illegally dumping into pristine watersheds. When he'd threatened to expose it all, they'd painted him as the architect of the scheme, complete with forged documents and fabricated evidence. "I made some enemies," he said finally. ELENA snorted, a sound that held no sympathy. "Must have been some enemies to send you running into wilderness you're clearly not equipped for." She ladled soup into a wooden bowl, the steam carrying scents that made his empty stomach clench with hunger. "This compass of yours kept you walking in circles for the better part of a week. Lucky thing, or you'd have wandered right off a cliff." James accepted the bowl with hands that shook slightly, whether from weakness or the memory of what he'd left behind, he couldn't say. The soup was unlike anything he'd ever tasted, rich with wild flavors that spoke of a life lived entirely outside the artificial constructs of civilization. "You live here alone?" he asked, looking around the cabin that somehow felt both primitive and perfectly designed for its purpose. 7 years now. Sailed onto a 3-legged stool near the stove, her own bowl balanced on her knees. "Haven't found much reason to go back to the world of parking meters and traffic lights." There was a story there, James realized, something that had driven this capable woman to choose isolation over society. But the way she held herself, alert and defensive even in her own home, suggested it wasn't a story she shared easily. "The men who are looking for you," Elena said, her dark eyes fixed on his face. "They the type to give up when things get difficult." James thought of Richard Blackwood, the CEO who'd built his empire on environmental destruction, disguised as progress. Blackwood had the resources to hire the best private investigators, the kind who didn't give up until they found what they were looking for. "No," he admitted, "they're not." Elena nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Then you'd better heal up fast, city boy, because hiding you is going to get complicated real quick, and I don't much like complications." Outside the cabin, wind moved through the pine branches with a sound like whispered warnings. James finished his soup and watched Elena clean her rifle with the methodical care of someone who understood that survival often came down to being prepared for violence. He'd stumbled into a sanctuary carrying nothing but his grandfather's broken compass and the knowledge that could destroy a billion-dollar corporation. Now, watching her hands work the cleaning rod through the rifle barrel, he wondered if he'd found salvation or simply delayed his destruction by a few days. Dawn came to the mountains like a slow burn, the sky lightening from black to deep purple to the pale gold that filtered through the canopy of ancient pines. Elena rose before the sun, as she had every morning for 7 years, her movements silent despite the cabin's creaking floorboards. The wooden flute lay on the windowsill where she'd placed it the night before, its surface worn smooth by generations of Cherokee hands before hers. James stirred on the makeshift bed as Elena banked the coals in the wood stove and added fresh kindling. His breathing had improved during the night, deeper and more regular, though fever still flushed his cheeks. City dwellers weren't built for the kind of punishment the wilderness could deliver, but something in his constitution suggested he might be tougher than his soft appearance indicated. Elena slipped outside into the pre-dawn cold, her breath forming small clouds as she checked the perimeter of her domain. The routine was sacred, developed through 7 years of living alone in country that could kill the careless or unprepared. She examined the game trails that crossed her property, looking for signs of unusual passage. She checked the spring that provided her water, tested the wind direction, and listened to the forest's subtle communications. 23 miles from the nearest road meant 23 miles of protection from the complications that other people invariably brought. Elena had chosen this location carefully, studying topographical maps and spending months hiking the area before selecting the small meadow where her cabin now stood. The clearing was large enough for a vegetable garden and small enough to defend, surrounded by dense forest that offered multiple escape routes for someone who knew the terrain. Her grandmother's flute caught the morning light as Elena paused on the cabin's threshold. Sarah Redhawk had carved it from mountain ash during the winter when Elena was 12, teaching her the old songs that connected their family to the land. Those songs had died with her grandmother 5 years ago, but the flute remained, the only physical link to a heritage that corporate America had tried to strip away piece by piece. Inside, James was attempting to sit up, his face gray with effort and determination. Elena watched him struggle for a moment before moving to help, noting how he tried to wave off her assistance even as his arms trembled with weakness. "Stubborn," she observed, settling him back against the pine bough pillows. "That might actually help you survive out here." "How long have I been unconscious?" James asked, accepting the cup of pine needle tea she offered. The brew would help with his strength and provide vitamin C his body desperately needed. 2 days, on and off. Your body's been fighting off infection from that gash on your leg." Elena returned to her morning preparations, grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle her grandmother had carved from local stone. "You're lucky it wasn't deeper, or you'd have bled out before I found you." James sipped the bitter tea and watched Elena work. Her movements held the fluid efficiency of someone completely at home in her environment. Every action purposeful and economical. She was beautiful in the way that mountain landscapes were beautiful, all sharp edges and untamed power, barely contained within human form. "Why did you help me?" he asked suddenly. Elena paused in her grinding, considering the question. The honest answer was complicated, involving dreams that had started 3 nights before she found him. Dreams of a wounded man carrying knowledge that could heal poisoned waters. Her grother would have called it vision, but Elena had learned to distrust anything that couldn't be touched or measured. "Maybe I was curious," she said finally. "Been a long time since anyone stumbled into my territory carrying corporate secrets and a compass that belonged to someone who actually knew how to read the land." She'd examined the compass while he slept, noting the inscription on the back. "To James, may you always find your way home. Love, Grandfather Samuel." The brass was old, military issue from an era when such instruments were built to last through wars and wilderness alike. "Your grandfather was military," Elena observed. It wasn't a question. James nodded slowly. "Korea. He used to take me camping when I was a kid, before my parents decided wilderness skills weren't practical for a future corporate executive." Bitterness crept into his voice. "Maybe if I'd listened better, I wouldn't have needed you to save my life." Elena resumed her grinding, the rhythmic sound filling the cabin's comfortable silence. Outside, the forest was fully awake now, birds calling from the canopy and small creatures rustling through the undergrowth. This was her world, the one she'd built from nothing after her previous life had been torn apart by men in expensive suits who saw the natural world as nothing more than resources to be exploited. "Your grandfather knew something your parents forgot," Elena said quietly. "Out here, practical means staying alive. Everything else is just noise." The fever hit James as evening shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. Elena watched his temperature climb, despite the herbal remedies she'd been forcing down his throat every few hours. His breathing became labored, and perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the mountain chill that seeped through the log walls. Elena pulled the patchwork quilt from her own bed, the tabak soft with age and countless washings. Each square told a story she preferred not to remember. Pieces of her mother's Sunday dress, fabric from the curtains in their family kitchen, scraps from the childhood quilt that had covered her during the winters before everything went wrong. She spread it over James's shivering form, tucking the edges carefully around his shoulders. "My mother made this," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her through the fever. "Took her 3 years to finish it, working by lamplight after her shifts at the factory." James's eyes opened, glassy but focused on her face. "Elena," he whispered. The first time he'd spoken her name, it sounded different coming from his lips, softer somehow than the harsh syllables she'd grown used to hearing in her own mind. "Don't try to talk," Elena said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Fever needs to break before you'll make much sense anyway." But James struggled to sit up, his hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "The files," he gasped, "hidden in my jacket. If something happens to me..." Elena found the waterproof envelope sewn into the lining of his torn jacket, documents that detailed 3 years of environmental crimes committed by Blackwood Industries. The papers told a story of systematic poisoning, of watersheds destroyed, and communities sickened in pursuit of quarterly profits. Each page represented another nail in the coffin of corporate executives who thought themselves untouchable. "This is what they want to kill you for?" Elena asked, studying photographs of dead fish floating in what had once been pristine mountain streams. That and more James managed before another wave of fever overwhelmed him. Elena fed the wood stove and settled in for a long night. She'd seen infection fever before, knew it could go either way depending on the patient's will to live and the body's ability to fight. James thrashed beneath the quilt, muttering names and numbers that meant nothing to her but everything to the legal case he'd apparently built against his former employers. Around midnight he began talking in his delirium, fragments of memory spilling out in broken sentences. He spoke of his grandfather, teaching him to read animal tracks in fresh snow, of corporate boardrooms that smelled like leather and lies, of a woman named Sarah who'd broken their engagement when the scandal broke. "She said I was naive," James whispered, his eyes fixed on something Elena couldn't see. "Said I should have known better than to trust people who put profits over everything else." Elena dampened a cloth in cool water and placed it on his forehead. "Maybe she was right about you being naive," she said quietly. "But that doesn't make you wrong." The fever broke sometime before dawn, leaving James weak but lucid. Elena dozed in her chair, the rifle propped against her knee in case his corporate enemies had somehow tracked them to this remote sanctuary. When she woke, pale sunlight was filtering through the cabin's single window, and James was watching her with clear eyes. "You stayed up all night," he observed, his voice hoarse but steady. "Didn't have much choice. You were talking enough to wake the dead, and some of what you said was pretty interesting." Elena stretched the kinks from her neck and moved to check the wood stove. "Your fever's broken, but you're still weak as a newborn calf." James tried to smile, though the effort seemed to cost him. "My grandfather used to say that fever was the body's way of burning out poison. Looks like I had plenty to burn." Elena ladled soup into a bowl, adding extra herbs that would help restore his strength. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. Too bad you didn't listen to him about staying away from corporate serpents." "He tried to warn me," James admitted, accepting the soup gratefully. "Said the mountains don't lie the way people do. Guess I had to learn that lesson the hard way." Outside, the forest was waking to another day. Birds calling from the pine canopy and small creatures beginning their search for food. Elena watched James eat slowly, noting the color returning to his cheeks. He would live, she realized, though whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Elena's bone-handle hunting knife caught the morning sunlight as she cleaned it with methodical precision. The blade had belonged to her father, forged by a Cherokee blacksmith, who understood that a knife was more than a tool. It was an extension of the user's will to survive. She'd carried it for 15 years, through situations that would have broken lesser blades and weaker people. "Time to see what you're made of, city boy," Elena announced, slipping the knife into its worn leather sheath. James had been on his feet for 2 days now, moving around the cabin with increasing steadiness. But Elena knew that recovery in controlled conditions meant nothing compared to performance under pressure. James followed her outside, still favoring his injured leg but determined not to show weakness. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and frost glittered on the pine needles like scattered diamonds. Elena led him to a clearing where she'd set up what looked like an obstacle course designed by someone with an intimate understanding of wilderness survival. "First test," Elena said, pointing to a depression in the ground filled with dry leaves and twigs. "Build a fire that will last through the night using only what you can find within 50 feet of this spot. No matches, no lighter, no modern conveniences." James stared at the pile of tinder with the expression of a man who'd just been asked to perform surgery with a butter knife. "I've never built a fire without matches." "Then you'd better learn fast. Out here, fire means life. No fire means you freeze to death or become something's dinner." Elena settled against a nearby tree, clearly prepared to watch him struggle. "Your grandfather never taught you." "He tried," James admitted, kneeling beside the fire pit and examining the available materials. "But my parents thought camping was a waste of time when I could be studying for college entrance exams." Elena pulled her father's knife from its sheath and began cleaning her fingernails with the point, a gesture that managed to be both casual and intimidating. "Studying's fine, but it won't keep you warm when the temperature drops below freeze." James gathered dry pine needles and arranged them in what he hoped was a proper tinder nest. His movements were clumsy compared to Elena's fluid efficiency, but she noted that he approached the task methodically, thinking through each step rather than rushing ahead blind. "Tell me about your grandfather," Elena said as James struggled with a bow drill he'd constructed from dead branches. "Samuel Mitchell, Army Corps of Engineers in Korea, then spent 30 years working for the Forest Service." James paused in his drilling to wipe sweat from his forehead. "He used to say that nature was the only honest teacher, because she'd kill you if you didn't pay attention. Smart man. What happened to him?" "Lung cancer 10 years ago. Cigarettes, not the clean mountain air he loved." James resumed his drilling, and Elena was surprised to see a thin wisp of smoke rising from his tinder bundle. "He left me his compass and a dozen letters I was supposed to read when I needed guidance. I never opened them." The tinder caught with a small puff of flame that James carefully nursed into a sustainable fire. Elena nodded approval, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "Not bad for a corporate executive. Your grandfather taught you more than you realize." The second test involved identifying edible plants, a skill that could mean the difference between survival and starvation in extended wilderness situations. ELENA watched James examine various leaves and berries, noting that he approached each specimen with appropriate caution. "This looks like wild onion," James said, holding up a cluster of thin green shoots. ELENA's father's knife appeared in her hand with startling speed, the point stopping just inches from James's wrist. "Crush it and smell," she commanded. Death Kamars look similar enough to fool city dwellers who think they know what they're looking at. James crushed the plant between his fingers, and the sharp, familiar scent of onion filled the air. ELENA lowered the knife but didn't sheath it. "Right answer, wrong answer, gets you dead within 6 hours, convulsions and respiratory failure." "Jesus," James breathed, staring at the innocent-looking plant with new respect. "Out here, close enough isn't good enough. The mountains don't grade on a curve." ELENA finally returned the knife to its sheath. "But you're learning. That's more than most city dwellers manage on their first day." As the afternoon wore on, ELENA tested James's ability to read weather signs, follow animal tracks, and navigate using natural landmarks. He failed more often than he succeeded, but his failures were thoughtful rather than reckless, and he absorbed each lesson with the focused attention of someone who understood the stakes. By evening, James had managed to catch 2 fish using a trap. ELENA had shown him how to construct, proving that his corporate problem-solving skills could adapt to wilderness challenges when properly directed. The faded photograph lay hidden beneath loose floorboards, where ELENA thought no one would ever find it. The image showed a younger version of herself, standing between her parents outside a modest house in Oklahoma, all 3 of them smiling at the camera, with the unconscious confidence of people who believed the future held only good things. ELENA's hands trembled slightly as she held the photograph, a reaction that would have surprised anyone who knew her reputation as the untouchable mountain woman. James sat beside the stream they'd been fishing, cleaning the trout he'd managed to catch using techniques she'd taught him over the past week. His movements had grown more confident, though he still possessed the careful precision of someone who understood he was operating outside his area of expertise. "My father was an environmental lawyer," ELENA said suddenly, her voice cutting through the soft sound of running water. "Spent 20 years fighting corporations that poisoned reservation land and got away with it because nobody in Washington cared about dead Indians." James looked up from the fish he was gutting, sensing the weight behind her words. "What happened to him?" "Car accident on a rainy night outside Tulsa. At least, that's what the police report said." ELENA's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. "Funny thing about that accident, though, happened 2 days after he'd gathered enough evidence to shut down a copper mining operation that was dumping arsenic into the local water supply. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire." James set down his knife and gave ELENA his full attention, recognizing the significance of what she was sharing. The mining company had friends in high places, contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. My father was just one Cherokee lawyer, with a conscience and a stubborn streak. ELENA's voice remained steady, but James could see the old pain flickering behind her dark eyes. "After the funeral, men in expensive suits started visiting my mother, making generous offers for our land. When she refused to sell, the harassment began." James understood corporate intimidation tactics better than most, having witnessed them firsthand during his years climbing the executive ladder. "They made your lives hell until you had no choice but to leave. My mother lasted 6 months before the stress killed her. Heart attack at 47, perfectly healthy woman who'd never had so much as high blood pressure." ELENA folded the photograph carefully and slipped it back into her jacket pocket. "I was 25, just finished my master's degree in environmental science. Thought I could pick up where my father left off. But they came after you too." ELENA's laugh held no humor. "Oh, they were more subtle with me. No midnight phone calls or dead animals left on the porch. Instead, I couldn't get hired anywhere in my field. Every job interview went perfectly until they ran background checks. Then suddenly the positions were filled or funding had been cut." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition of someone who'd been systematically destroyed by people with more power and fewer scruples. "They blacklisted you." "Completely. 7 years ago, I was working as a waitress in Albuquerque watching my student loans pile up while my environmental science degree collected dust. Elena picked up her fishing rod and cast the line into a deeper pool where shadows suggested larger fish might be hiding. That's when I decided to disappear entirely. Sold everything I owned, bought supplies, and walked into these mountains. And you've been here ever since. Best decision I ever made. Can't be betrayed by people you never trust in the first place. Elena's line went taut, and she began working a good-sized trout toward shore. What about you? Sarah, somebody was her name, right? You mentioned her during your fever. James's hand stilled on the fish he'd been cleaning. Sarah Brennan. We were engaged for 2 years, planning a wedding that would have made the society pages. She was everything my parents wanted in a daughter-in-law. Connected family, impeccable credentials, knew how to navigate corporate social events. But she didn't stand by you when things got difficult. The opposite. When the scandal broke, she was one of the first to suggest I might actually be guilty. Said maybe I'd gotten too ambitious and cut corners to impress the board. James's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd learned that love could evaporate the moment it became inconvenient. She returned the ring via courier, along with a note explaining that she couldn't be associated with someone who'd damaged their social standing. Elena landed her fish and began the process of cleaning it with swift, efficient strokes. Sounds like she did you a favor. Better to find out who someone really is before you marry them. Maybe, but it still felt like being kicked when I was already down. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Elena looked up at the darkening sky with the automatic assessment of someone who'd learned to read weather as a matter of survival. Storm coming, we should head back. They gathered their gear and cleaned fish in companionable silence, both lost in memories of people who'd failed them when loyalty mattered most. Elena's worn leather gloves bore the stains of countless seasons, their surface darkened by years of hard mountain labor and the kind of determination that refused to yield to circumstance. She pulled them on with practiced efficiency as dawn broke over the pine canopy, preparing for what would be James's most crucial lesson yet. Today we find out if you can actually survive out here, Elena announced, shouldering a pack filled with minimal supplies. 24 hours, just you and the mountains. I'll be watching, but I won't help unless you're about to die. James looked up from lacing his boots, noting the serious set to Elena's features. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd grown accustomed to her teaching methods, which involved equal parts instruction and intimidation. But this felt different, more like a final exam than a practice session. What if I fail, he asked, testing the weight of his own pack. Then you go back to whatever city life you can salvage, and we pretend this never happened. Elena's dark eyes held no compromise. The mountains don't have room for people who can't pull their own weight. They hiked deeper into Elena's territory than James had ventured before, following game trails that wound through dense forest and across rocky outcroppings that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Elena moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, while James followed with the careful attention of a student who understood his life might depend on remembering every detail. Your grandfather's compass will get you back to the cabin, Elena said when they reached a clearing roughly 5 miles from her home. But only if you can read the terrain well enough to avoid the cliff faces and bare dens between here and there. James studied the topographical features Elena had been teaching him to recognize, noting the way water flowed through the landscape and how different tree species indicated elevation and soil conditions. The knowledge felt fragile in his mind, a academic understanding that hadn't yet been tested by genuine necessity. What about food? James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. What about it? You've learned to identify edible plants, set snares for small game, and construct fish traps. Whether you eat tonight depends on how well you retained those lessons. Elena adjusted her gloves and turned to leave. I'll be back at sunrise. Try not to get yourself killed. James watched her disappear into the forest, with movements so quiet they barely disturbed the fallen leaves. Then he was alone with nothing but his grandfather's compass, the skills ELENA had drilled into him, and the growing certainty that he was either about to prove himself or die trying. The first challenge came within an hour, when James encountered a stream too wide and fast to cross safely at the obvious ford. He spent precious daylight searching for an alternative crossing, remembering ELENA's lectures about how most wilderness deaths resulted from people taking unnecessary risks with moving water. He found a fallen log upstream that bridged the current, though crossing it required the kind of balance and nerve he'd never needed in corporate boardrooms. Halfway across, with cold water rushing beneath him, James understood why ELENA had insisted on this test. Every skill she'd taught him was proving essential for tasks as simple as getting from one side of a stream to the other. By afternoon, James had successfully gathered enough edible plants to supplement the emergency rations in his pack, though his attempts at setting snares for small game proved frustratingly unsuccessful. The forest seemed full of creatures that remained just out of reach, their tracks visible in soft earth, but the animals themselves too clever for his novice techniques. As evening approached, James found himself studying the landscape with new intensity, searching for the combination of shelter, water access, and defensive positioning that ELENA had taught him to recognize. He settled on a spot beneath an overhanging rock formation that would provide protection from wind and rain, while offering clear views of the surrounding approaches. Building a fire without matches had become routine over the past weeks, but doing it while tired and alone felt different. Each step required conscious effort rather than automatic response, and James found himself talking through the process aloud, using his own voice to maintain focus as darkness gathered around his small circle of light. The night brought sounds he'd learned to identify during his time with ELENA: the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small nocturnal creatures moving through the undergrowth, the crack of settling timber cooling after the day's warmth. But tonight, those familiar sounds felt charged with potential threat rather than comfort. James dozed fitfully, waking frequently to tend his fire and listen for anything that suggested danger approaching his temporary camp. Each time he opened his eyes, ELENA's lessons echoed in his mind, her voice reminding him that survival meant staying alert, even when exhausted. The brass shell casing glinted in the morning sunlight as ELENA ejected it from her rifle's chamber, the metallic ping echoing across the clearing, where James had spent his first night alone in the wilderness. She'd been watching him from a distance, noting his competent fire management and the defensive positioning he'd chosen for his camp. The man was learning, adapting to mountain life with a determination that surprised her. But the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the forest silence changed everything. ELENA dropped prone behind a fallen log, her rifle already tracking the aircraft as it passed overhead in a systematic search pattern. The helicopter bore no markings, its black paint scheme designed to avoid identification rather than serve any official purpose. Through her rifle scope, she could see men in tactical gear, scanning the ground below with professional intensity. James emerged from his shelter at the sound, looking up at the aircraft with the expression of a man who recognized his past catching up with him. ELENA hissed a warning that carried across the clearing, and he immediately sought cover behind the rock formation that had sheltered him through the night. The helicopter made 3 passes over the area before moving on, its systematic grid pattern suggesting the search would continue throughout the surrounding forest. ELENA waited a full hour after the sound faded before approaching James's position, moving through the trees with the silent efficiency that had kept her hidden from the outside world for 7 years. Corporate investigators, ELENA asked, though she already knew the answer from James's pale expression. Blackwood Industries has connections everywhere. If they've hired private military contractors to find me, it means they're getting desperate. James shouldered his pack with hands that trembled slightly. I should leave. They'll tear apart these mountains looking for me, and you'll get caught in the crossfire. ELENA studied his face, noting the mixture of fear and resignation that suggested he was already mentally preparing to run again. Where would you go? They found you once already, and that was when you had resources and connections. At least I'd be drawing them away from you. The concern in his voice touched something ELENA had thought she'd buried beneath 7 years of deliberate isolation. You think I can't handle a few corporate mercenaries? I think you shouldn't have to. This isn't your fight. Elena's laugh held no humor as she checked her rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Boy, you still don't understand what you stumbled into out here. Those environmental reports you're carrying, they document crimes against the same watershed my father died trying to protect. James stared at her, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The copper mining operation that killed your parents was owned by Blackwood Industries, subsidiary corporation, shell company, different name on the paperwork, but the same poison flowing into the same rivers, the same pattern of intimidation and murder disguised as accident. Elena's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd spent years researching her family's destruction. So this became my fight the moment you walked into my territory, carrying evidence that could finally bring them down. They moved through the forest like hunters rather than prey, Elena leading James along routes that would confuse aerial surveillance while keeping them within striking distance of her cabin. Her knowledge of the terrain was absolute, accumulated through 7 years of mapping every game trail, water source, and defensive position within a 20-mile radius. There, Elena whispered, pointing toward a ridge where sunlight glinted off metal and glass. Observation post. Probably been there since yesterday. James squinted through the trees until he could make out the camouflaged blind, where someone was watching Elena's cabin through high-powered optics. How many do you think? 4-man team minimum for an operation this remote. Professional contractors, military trained, probably carrying equipment worth more than most people make in a year. Elena's assessment was delivered with the detached professionalism of someone evaluating a tactical situation. They're good, but they're operating in my territory using urban warfare training that doesn't apply out here. They spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance, mapping the positions of 2 additional observation posts, and identifying the landing zone where the helicopter had dropped the search team. Elena's movements through the forest were so quiet that James felt clumsy by comparison, despite weeks of training in wilderness skills. "Tonight we move," Elena announced as shadows lengthened across the mountainside. "They'll be expecting you to run, so instead we're going to hunt them." James felt his stomach tighten at the casual way Elena discussed violence, though he understood the necessity. "You've done this before. My father taught me that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to hit back harder than they expect." Elena checked the spare ammunition in her pack with methodical care. These corporate soldiers think they're dealing with a frightened fugitive and a harmless mountain hermit. Time to show them how wrong they are. The ancient stone cairn rose from the mountain meadow like a prayer made manifest, its weathered rocks stacked by Cherokee hands. Generations before European settlers first glimpsed these peaks, Elena approached the sacred marker with the reverence of someone who understood she was walking on hallowed ground, her footsteps careful and deliberate, despite the urgency driving them deeper into the wilderness. James followed her through the pre-dawn darkness, his breathing labored from the altitude and the relentless pace Elena had maintained since they'd slipped away from the corporate search teams. They'd been climbing for 6 hours, following game trails so faint they seemed more suggestion than path, always moving higher into country where helicopters couldn't easily follow. "This is as far as they'll track us," Elena said, settling beside the cairn with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd reached genuine sanctuary. "These stones mark the boundary of Cherokee hunting grounds that have been sacred for 800 years. Even corporate mercenaries have enough sense not to desecrate holy ground." The meadow spread before them like a natural amphitheater, surrounded by peaks that caught the first light of dawn and reflected it back in shades of gold and crimson. James had never seen country so untouched by human influence, where the only sounds were wind moving through pine branches and the distant call of an eagle riding the morning thermals. "Your grandmother told you about this place?" James asked, noting the way Elena's posture relaxed for the first time since the helicopter had appeared over their camp. "She brought me here when I was 16, after my first vision quest. Said it was where our family had always come to seek guidance from the ancestors." Elena's fingers traced the smooth surface of the topmost stone, worn by countless hands across the centuries. "I haven't been back since she died." James understood the significance of Elena sharing this sacred space with him, the trust it represented, and the vulnerability it revealed. In the growing light he could see tears tracking down her cheeks, though her voice remained steady. "What did you see during your vision quest?" he asked quietly. "A man carrying poisoned water, walking out of the sunrise toward our sacred places. My grandmother said it meant I would someday have to choose between protecting the land and protecting the people trying to destroy it." Elena's laugh held more pain than humor. "Guess I know now which choice I made." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, its warmth driving away the mountain chill that had pursued them through the night. James felt something fundamental shifting inside him, a recognition that his flight from corporate persecution had led him to something far more important than mere survival. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything, "I think I'm falling in love with you." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of the casual dishonesty she'd learned to expect from people who claimed to care about her. "You barely know me. I know you saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. I know you spent 3 weeks teaching me skills that your family guarded for generations. I know you're risking everything to protect evidence that could finally bring justice for your parents." James moved closer, his hand covering hers on the ancient stone. "I know that being with you feels like coming home to a place I never knew I was looking for." Elena's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart seemed to tremble. "James, I can't. Every person I've ever cared about has been taken away or driven off by the same people who are hunting you now. Then maybe it's time to stop running from them and start fighting back." The kiss happened without conscious decision, born from weeks of growing attraction and the recognition that they might not survive long enough to explore what was building between them. Elena's lips were soft, despite her hard-earned calluses and mountain-weathered skin, and James tasted salt from tears he wasn't sure belonged to her or him. When they broke apart, the world seemed different somehow, as if the ancient stones had witnessed their declaration and approved. Elena's hand remained in his, their fingers eaten like the roots of trees that had grown together over decades of shared soil. "If we do this," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's no going back. My life, my world. It's not the kind of place where corporate executives usually find happiness." James looked out over the sacred meadow, at the peaks that stretched to the horizon, like promises of adventures yet to come. "Maybe it's time I stopped being a corporate executive and started being the man my grandfather hoped I'd become." Elena smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression James had seen cross her features since he'd stumbled into her territory. He would have liked this place. "Your grandfather, I mean, men who understand the land usually do." James's corporate smartphone lay at the bottom of the mountain stream, its waterlogged screen dark and useless, beneath the clear running water. He'd thrown it there himself, watching bubbles rise from its dying circuits like the last breaths of his former life. The device that had once connected him to a world of stock prices and board meetings now served as habitat for curious trout and a symbol of bridges permanently burned. Elena sat beside him on the stream bank, her hand resting on his shoulder as they watched the current carry away the last physical link to his corporate existence. 3 days had passed since their kiss at the sacred cairn. 3 days of growing intimacy and the kind of honest conversation that stripped away pretense like winter wind removing dead leaves. "Tell me all of it," Elena said quietly. "Not the sanitized version you've been giving me, but everything. If we're going to face what's coming together, I need to know exactly what we're up against." James drew a deep breath, tasting the clean mountain air that would soon be replaced by the recycled atmosphere of courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms if his plan succeeded. Blackwood Industries has been systematically poisoning waterways across 7 states for the past 15 years. They developed a process for extracting rare earth minerals that produces toxic waste they can't legally dispose of, so they dispose of it illegally. Worse than that, they built their entire business model around environmental crime, calculating the cost of cleanup and litigation as acceptable losses compared to the profits from mining operations. James's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd discovered that his life's work had been built on systematic destruction. "I spent 3 years documenting every illegal dump site, every bribed inspector, every falsified environmental impact study." Elena's fingers tightened on his shoulder. That's why they want you dead. You can destroy them completely. The evidence I gathered could result in criminal charges for 67 executives, including Richard Blackwood himself. We're talking about environmental crimes that make the Exxon Valdez spill look like a minor accident. James picked up a smooth river stone and turned it over in his hands, noting its perfect weight and balance. But gathering the evidence required me to pretend I was part of their conspiracy. I signed documents, approved budgets, attended meetings where we discussed covering up ecological disasters. They made you complicit. I made myself complicit. Every day I didn't blow the whistle was another day of contamination, another community poisoned, another watershed destroyed. The river stone felt heavy in James's palm, like the weight of every compromise he'd made in service of building an airtight legal case. The Navajo Reservation in Arizona, the fishing communities in Alaska, the farming towns in Montana where children started developing cancers at 10 times the national average. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing the scope of environmental destruction James had described. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the controlled fury of someone who understood exactly what corporate environmental crime looked like at the human level. My father would have said, you did what you had to do to gather evidence that could save future generations. The guilt you're carrying, that's proof you never lost sight of what was right. Elena turned to face him fully. But what about the people helping Blackwood cover this up? Your former colleagues, the ones who sent mercenaries after you. Most of them don't know the full scope. Blackwood compartmentalized everything, made sure no single person outside his inner circle could see the complete picture. James threw the river stone into the stream, watching ripples spread across the surface. That Sarah knew, my ex-fiancée. She was Blackwood's chief legal counsel. She helped design the shell company structure that hid the illegal dumping operations. The revelation hung between them, like smoke from a poisonous fire. Elena had assumed that Sarah was simply another casualty of James's whistleblowing, a relationship destroyed by external pressure rather than internal corruption. She betrayed you before the scandal ever broke public, Elena said, understanding flooding her voice. For 2 years she sat across from me at dinner and listened to me talk about my concerns over company environmental policies. She knew I was building a case that could destroy everything she'd helped create. James's hands clenched into fists. When I finally gathered enough evidence to go public, she convinced Blackwood's security team that I was preparing to steal corporate secrets for personal profit. She painted you as the criminal to cover her own crimes. Perfectly legal strategy from her perspective. Discredit the whistleblower, destroy his credibility, make him look like a disgruntled employee seeking revenge rather than a concerned citizen trying to prevent further environmental damage. The hand-woven rope Elena had crafted from mountain vines hung coiled beside their shelter, its fibers strong enough to bear the weight of 2 people rappelling down cliff faces or hauling supplies up impossible terrain. She'd learned the technique from her grandmother, who'd taught her that the strongest bonds were created by twisting individual strands together until they became something greater than their separate parts. Now, as Elena watched James sleep in the pre-dawn darkness, she understood that the rope served as a metaphor for what was happening between them. Each shared danger, every moment of vulnerability, every honest confession had added another strand to the connection binding them together. James stirred as the first light touched the entrance to their hidden cave, the sanctuary Elena had discovered during her second winter in the mountains. The cavern was large enough for 2 people and completely invisible from outside, its entrance concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines that had taken her months to cultivate into perfect camouflage. "Morning," James whispered, his voice still heavy with sleep, but his eyes immediately alert. 3 weeks of mountain living had taught him to wake ready for whatever dangers the wilderness might present. Elena moved closer, drawn by the warmth radiating from his body and the strange comfort she found in his presence. For 7 years she'd slept alone, listening to the night sounds of the forest and trusting no one but herself to watch for threats. Now she found herself relaxing her guard in ways that should have terrified her but instead felt like coming home. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Elena said, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket they shared. About going back to face the legal charges, fighting Blackwood Industries in court instead of hiding in the mountains. James turned to face her fully, noting the uncertainty in her voice. Having second thoughts? Not about supporting you. About leaving this place, going back to a world where people like Blackwood have power over life and death. Elena's hand found his beneath the blanket, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease lovers who'd learned to communicate through touch. Out here, I know the rules. I understand how to survive, how to protect myself, how to read the signs that warn of danger. The civilized world has different rules, but they're not impossible to learn. James shifted closer, eliminating the small space that had separated them during the night, and you wouldn't be facing it alone. Elena's breath caught as she felt the heat of his body against hers, the solid reality of another person who'd chosen to share her exile rather than abandon her for the safety of civilization. The intimacy was overwhelming, not just the physical closeness, but the emotional vulnerability that came with trusting someone completely. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind moving through the pine branches outside their shelter. He kissed her then, softly at first, and then with growing intensity as weeks of carefully controlled attraction finally found expression. Elena responded with a hunger that surprised them both, her hands tangling in his hair as she pulled him close. The kiss tasted of mountain water and wild honey, of shared dangers survived and promises yet to be fulfilled. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena saw something in James's eyes that made her heart race with possibilities she'd thought were lost to her forever. "Are you sure about this? Once we cross this line, everything changes." "Everything already changed. The moment I stumbled into your territory carrying evidence that could destroy the people who killed your parents." James's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, marveling at the contrast between her soft skin and the calloused strength of her hands. "I love you, Elena. Not just because you saved my life, but because being with you has shown me who I was meant to be." Elena felt tears gathering behind her eyes, though whether from joy or fear she couldn't say. "I love you too. That's what scares me." Their lovemaking was tender and desperate in equal measure, fueled by the knowledge that their time in this sanctuary was limited, and the future held uncertainties that could separate them forever. Elena discovered that James's corporate softness concealed surprising strength, while he marveled at the way mountain living had sculpted her body into an instrument of pure capability. Afterward they lay tangled together beneath the blanket, listening to the forest wake around them. Elena traced patterns on James's chest with her fingertip, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers. "When we go back," Elena said quietly, "will you still want this? Me, I mean. Will you still want me when you remember what your old life was like?" James captured her hand and pressed it flat against his heart. "My old life was built on lies and compromise. This, what we have here, is the first real thing I've felt in years." The trail camera's red LED blinked once in the darkness, before Elena's knife severed its power cable. The device had been positioned to monitor the game trail leading to their hidden sanctuary, its motion sensors capable of detecting human movement from 50 yards away. Elena examined the camera's mounting bracket with professional interest, noting the military-grade hardware and satellite uplink capability that marked it as far more sophisticated than standard hunting equipment. "Professional-grade surveillance," Elena whispered to James, who crouched beside her in the pre-dawn darkness. "Whoever's tracking us has resources I didn't expect." James studied the disabled camera with the expression of someone recognizing corporate efficiency applied to lethal purpose. "Blackwood's hired more than just mercenaries. This equipment costs more than most people make in a year." They've discovered 3 similar cameras during their systematic sweep of the area around their cave sanctuary, each positioned to create overlapping fields of surveillance that would have made escape impossible for anyone less familiar with the terrain. Elena's military training, inherited from her father's stories of Vietnam reconnaissance missions, had taught her to think like prey while acting like a predator. Motion sensors, night vision, probably facial recognition software that can identify us from satellite databases. ELENA enumerated the threats as she examined the camera's internal components. They're not just hunting us anymore. They're conducting a systematic manhunt with technology that makes hiding almost impossible. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the mountainside, closer than they'd been before and following a search pattern that suggested the pilots were being guided by real-time intelligence rather than random reconnaissance. ELENA and James pressed themselves flat against the rocky outcropping that concealed their position, watching the aircraft's searchlight sweep the forest below. There, James pointed toward a ridge, roughly a mile to the south, where muzzle flashes flickered in the darkness. Someone shooting at the helicopter. ELENA's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Decoy operation. They're drawing the search away from our actual position, while other teams move in on foot. The helicopter veered toward the gunfire, its searchlight illuminating a lone figure, who fired several more shots before disappearing into the forest. ELENA recognized the tactics from her father's war stories, the kind of coordinated misdirection that required military-level planning and execution. "We're not dealing with corporate security anymore," ELENA said, her voice tight with recognition. "These are professional soldiers, probably special operations veterans hired as private contractors." James felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. "How many? 8 to 12-man team based on the coordination I'm seeing. They've got us surrounded, but they're being careful because they know I'm armed and familiar with the terrain." ELENA began moving through the darkness with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent 7 years learning every defensive position within 20 miles. The good news is that soldiers trained for urban warfare make predictable mistakes in wilderness environments. They moved through the forest like ghosts, ELENA leading James along routes that avoided open ground and natural choke points where an ambush would be most effective. Her knowledge of the terrain was absolute, accumulated through years of mapping every game trail, water source and escape route within her domain. "Contact," ELENA whispered, dropping to one knee behind a fallen log. 2 men, moving northeast along the stream bed. James could barely make out the figures ELENA had spotted, their camouflaged uniforms blending perfectly with the forest shadows. But ELENA's eyes, trained by years of wilderness living, could detect movement that urban dwellers would miss entirely. Night vision goggles, suppressed weapons, tactical communication gear. ELENA's assessment was delivered with the detached professionalism of someone evaluating a combat situation. "They're hunting us like we're enemy combatants, rather than fugitives." The realization that someone was willing to commit military-level resources to silencing James's testimony spoke to the enormous stakes involved. ELENA understood that they were no longer dealing with corporate intimidation, but with systematic elimination of witnesses who could destroy a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. "We can't keep running," James said quietly, watching the armed figures move through terrain that ELENA knew better than anyone alive. "Eventually they'll corner us, and when they do, we'll both be killed." ELENA's smile was visible even in the darkness, carrying the kind of predatory satisfaction that had earned her reputation as someone to avoid among local hunters and hikers. "Then it's time to stop being prey and start being hunters ourselves." She began checking her equipment with methodical care, confirming that her rifle was loaded and her father's hunting knife was secured in its sheath. These soldiers think they're dealing with a frightened corporate executive and a harmless mountain hermit. Time to show them how wrong they are. ELENA's weather-beaten almanac lay open to October's forecast, its pages yellowed with age and marked with handwritten notes, accumulated over 7 years of mountain observation. The book had belonged to her grandmother, who taught her that understanding seasonal patterns meant the difference between survival and death in country where winter could arrive weeks earlier than lowland predictions suggested. "Storm coming," ELENA announced, studying the cloud formations gathering over the western peaks. "Big one, judging by the way the wildlife's been behaving. Could dump 3 feet of snow and drop temperatures below 0 for a week." James looked up from cleaning his rifle, a skill ELENA had insisted he master after their first encounter with Blackwood's mercenaries. "How long do we have?" 48 hours, maybe less." Elena traced the weather patterns marked in her grandmother's careful handwriting, noting how similar conditions had historically developed into the kind of storms that shut down all travel for days at a time. Once it hits, nothing moves in these mountains except animals smart enough to find shelter and stay put. The implications were both promising and terrifying. The storm would provide perfect cover for their planned counterattack against the mercenary teams, but it would also trap them in hostile territory with limited supplies and no possibility of outside support. Elena understood mountain weather with the intimacy of someone who'd survived 7 winters without central heating or weather services. But this storm felt different somehow, more dangerous than the seasonal patterns she'd learned to navigate. "The men hunting us," James said, checking his rifle's action with movements that had become automatic over the past weeks. "They won't be prepared for mountain weather like this. That's what I'm counting on." Urban soldiers trained for desert operations don't understand what 3 feet of snow can do to equipment, communications, and basic mobility. Elena consulted the almanac's detailed notes about historical storm patterns. "My grandmother wrote about a storm in 1987 that stranded a group of experienced hunters for 11 days. They were found 3 miles from their truck, dead from hypothermia, because they couldn't navigate in whiteout conditions." Elena began preparing their cave sanctuary for extended occupation, checking food supplies and ensuring their heating arrangements could sustain them through a prolonged siege. The cave's natural insulation would protect them from the worst of the cold, but surviving a major storm required careful resource management and the kind of patience that city dwellers rarely developed. "We'll use the storm as cover to eliminate their observation posts," Elena explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across their supply cache. "Poor visibility will neutralize their technological advantages, and cold weather will force them to choose between maintaining surveillance and preserving their own lives." James studied the tactical situation with growing appreciation for Elena's strategic thinking. His corporate background had taught him to analyze complex problems systematically, but Elena's approach combined analytical thinking with intuitive understanding of how human behavior changed under extreme environmental stress. "What about communication? They'll try to call for extraction once the weather turns bad. Radio communications become unreliable during heavy snowstorms, especially in mountainous terrain. Satellite phones work better, but they require clear lines of sight that become impossible when you're pinned down in a survival shelter." Elena's smile held the predatory satisfaction of someone who'd turned environmental challenges into tactical advantages. "By the time the storm clears, we'll have eliminated their forward positions and forced them back to defensive positions they're not equipped to maintain." The temperature had already begun dropping, and Elena could smell snow in the air with the sensitivity of someone who'd learned to read weather through subtle environmental cues. Wildlife behavior confirmed her almanac's predictions. Birds were seeking sheltered roosts earlier than usual, and the small mammals that usually foraged throughout the day had disappeared entirely. "There's something else," Elena said, closing the almanac with the careful reverence she reserved for her grandmother's possessions. "The storm will make helicopter operations impossible for at least a week. No medical evacuation, no supply drops, no tactical support from outside the immediate area. Meaning whatever happens during the next few days, we're completely on our own. Both sides are on their own, but we're fighting in our home territory while they're trapped in hostile environment they don't understand." Elena began checking her cold weather gear, ensuring every piece of equipment was ready for the brutal conditions approaching. "The question is whether we can eliminate enough of their people to survive what comes after the storm." James understood that Elena was proposing more than tactical maneuvering. She was suggesting they use the storm as cover for systematically hunting the people who'd invaded their sanctuary, turning the mountains themselves into a weapon against enemies who'd underestimated the power of terrain and weather combined with local knowledge. "How many do you think we can take?" James asked, surprised by his own willingness to contemplate violence that would have horrified his former self. Elena's dark eyes reflected the approaching storm's deadly promise. "All of them, if we're smart about it." The hand-forged bear trap lay concealed beneath a thin layer of snow and pine needles, its steel jaws spring-loaded with enough force to shatter a human leg. ELENA's father had crafted it during the winter of 1963, back when black bears were still common in these mountains, and livestock predation was a serious concern for isolated homesteaders. Now it served a different purpose, transformed from agricultural tool into instrument of war. ELENA adjusted the trap's positioning with practiced efficiency, ensuring the trigger mechanism would activate when stepped on, but remain invisible to someone moving quickly through the forest. She'd learned the technique from her father's stories about Vietnam, where Viet Cong fighters had used similar devices to devastating effect against American patrols. 3 more along the ridge. ELENA whispered to James, pointing toward the natural choke points where pursuing mercenaries would be forced to move single file through dense undergrowth. They'll be following our trail, thinking they're closing in for the kill. The blizzard had been raging for 18 hours, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white death, where visibility dropped to mere yards and every sound was muffled by the howling wind. ELENA moved through the storm with supernatural confidence, navigating by landmarks invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 7 years memorizing every tree and rock formation within a 20-mile radius. James followed her with growing admiration for the tactical genius she'd developed through necessity and natural aptitude. His corporate training had taught him strategic thinking, but ELENA's approach to warfare combined intellectual analysis with intuitive understanding of how environmental factors affected human behavior under extreme stress. Motion sensors detected movement along the southern approach, ELENA said, checking the handheld device she'd salvaged from one of the mercenary surveillance posts they'd eliminated during the storm's first night. 8 contacts, moving in tactical formation toward our primary shelter. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. ELENA was using the enemy's own technology against them, turning their sophisticated surveillance network into an early warning system that gave her perfect intelligence about their movements while leaving them blind to her preparation. "They think they've cornered us in the cave," James observed, studying the tactical display with appreciation for ELENA's misdirection. "Meanwhile, we're setting up a killing field along their only escape route." ELENA's smile was visible even through the swirling snow, carrying the kind of predatory satisfaction that had earned her reputation as the most dangerous person in these mountains. Urban warfare training teaches soldiers to control terrain by establishing defensive positions. Mountain warfare is about using terrain to control your enemies. The first explosion echoed across the mountainside as someone triggered the improvised mine ELENA had constructed from materials salvaged from their abandoned camp. The device wasn't designed to kill, but to wound and demoralize while alerting ELENA to the exact position of the advancing mercenaries. "Contact," ELENA announced, settling into the sniper's position she'd prepared behind a fallen log that provided perfect concealment while offering clear fields of fire across the killing zone. 400 yards. Multiple targets moving through the deadfall section. James took position 20 yards to ELENA's left, his rifle trained on the secondary approach route, where tactical doctrine would force the mercenaries to maneuver once they realized they'd walked into an ambush. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, muscle memory developed through weeks of ELENA's relentless training. The mercenaries moved with professional competence, but ELENA could see they were struggling with conditions no amount of urban combat experience could have prepared them for. Snow clogged their equipment, cold affected their manual dexterity, and the disorienting effects of whiteout conditions made navigation nearly impossible for people unfamiliar with the terrain. 8 targets confirmed, ELENA whispered into the radio headset she'd taken from the first surveillance post they'd overrun, spread across a 200-yard front, moving northeast toward the cave entrance. ELENA's first shot took the point man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow where he lay screaming warnings that were lost in the howling wind. The mercenary immediately sought cover, but ELENA had chosen her position to deny them any effective defensive option. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, though it felt like hours to James as he watched ELENA systematically eliminate targets with the methodical precision of someone who'd turned warfare into an art form. Her shots were carefully placed to wound rather than kill, understanding that wounded enemies consumed more resources and created greater psychological pressure than dead ones. "Ceasefire," ELENA announced as the surviving mercenaries retreated through the forest, carrying their wounded and abandoning equipment too heavy for rapid movement through deep snow. "Let them go. They'll spread word about what happens to people who invade our territory." James lowered his rifle, noting that ELENA had orchestrated the entire engagement to send a message rather than simply eliminate threats. "You could have killed them all. Killing them would have solved nothing. Letting them escape with stories about the crazy mountain woman who turned their professional operation into a disaster that sends a message to whoever might consider coming after us next." ELENA's red bandana was soaked with blood by the time she finished applying pressure to the gunshot wound in James's shoulder. The fabric, once bright as summer poppies, now bore the dark stain of violence. Survived and prices paid for freedom. She worked with steady hands despite the shrapnel cut across her own cheek, her field medicine training taking over as adrenaline gave way to the methodical business of keeping them both alive. Through and through, ELENA announced with relief, examining the entry and exit wounds that marked James's shoulder. "Missed the bone, missed the major blood vessels. You'll live, but you'll be wearing a sling for the next month." James gritted his teeth as ELENA cleaned the wound with alcohol from her medical kit, the pain sharp enough to cut through the combat euphoria that had sustained him during the firefight. "How many did we get?" 3 down, 5 retreating through the storm. "The wounded will slow them down, and the weather will finish what we started." ELENA wrapped the bandana around James's shoulder with practiced efficiency, creating a field dressing that would control bleeding until they could reach better shelter. "But this isn't over. The ones who escaped will call for reinforcements." The blizzard continued its assault on the mountainside, transforming their battlefield into a white wilderness, where tracks disappeared within minutes and visibility remained limited to arm's length. ELENA helped James to his feet, noting how he favored his wounded shoulder, but maintained the determined expression of someone who understood the fight was far from finished. "Can you move?" ELENA asked, shouldering both their packs while keeping her rifle ready for immediate use. "I can move," James confirmed, though his voice carried the strain of someone operating on willpower rather than physical capability. "Where are we going?" "Higher. The storm will cover our withdrawal, and altitude will give us tactical advantage if they try to pursue us." ELENA began leading them through the forest, along routes that would confuse tracking while providing multiple defensive positions if they encountered additional mercenaries. They climbed through the howling wind and driving snow, ELENA navigating by landmarks invisible to anyone less familiar with the terrain. James followed with grim determination, understanding that stopping to rest might mean freezing to death before they reached adequate shelter. The wound in his shoulder burned with each movement, but the alternative to continuing was death by hypothermia or corporate assassination. "There," ELENA pointed toward a rocky outcropping barely visible through the swirling snow. "Natural shelter, with clear fields of fire. We can hold that position indefinitely if necessary." The cave ELENA had spotted was smaller than their previous sanctuary, but offered everything they needed for extended defense. A narrow entrance that could be easily defended, multiple escape routes through passages too small for tactical teams, and natural chimney formations that would disperse smoke from their fire to avoid detection. ELENA built a small fire while James secured the entrance using debris and snow to create concealment that would hide their position from aerial surveillance. The warmth felt miraculous after hours of exposure to sub-zero temperatures, and both of them stripped off outer layers that had become soaked with melted snow during their climb. "Let me see that cut," James said, noting the blood seeping from the shrapnel wound across ELENA's cheek. ELENA submitted to his ministrations with uncharacteristic vulnerability, allowing James to clean and bandage the injury with supplies from their shared medical kit. The cut was shallow but long, stretching from her left temple to the corner of her mouth in a line that would leave a permanent scar. "Badge of honor," James said softly, applying antiseptic with gentle precision. "Proof that you fought for something worth fighting for." ELENA caught his hand as he finished bandaging her wound, their fingers intertwining with the automatic intimacy of people who'd shared violence and survival in equal measure. "We both did. Whatever happens next, we faced them together and won." Outside their shelter, The storm continued its relentless assault on the mountainside, but inside the small cave, warmth and safety created a temporary sanctuary where they could process what they'd accomplished. ELENA leaned against James's uninjured shoulder, careful not to aggravate his wound while drawing comfort from his solid presence. "The evidence," ELENA said quietly. "It's still hidden in the cave where we were staying. If something happens to us, no one will ever know about Blackwood's crimes." James was quiet for a moment, considering options that balanced personal survival against the larger responsibility they carried to expose environmental destruction that affected thousands of people. "Then we make sure nothing happens to us. We survive long enough to get that evidence into the right hands." ELENA smiled despite her exhaustion and pain, recognizing the transformation that had occurred in the corporate executive who'd stumbled into her territory weeks ago. "My grandmother would have said, 'You found your warrior spirit.'" "I found something worth fighting for," James replied, his arm tightening around her despite the protest from his wounded shoulder. "I found you." ELENA's hands moved with practiced precision as she ground dried willow bark into powder, the medicinal herbs representing generations of Cherokee healing knowledge passed down through women who understood that nature provided everything necessary for survival. The mortar and pestle had belonged to her grandmother, carved from mountain stone during the winter. Sarah Redhawk had recovered from pneumonia, using nothing but plants gathered from the forest floor. "This will help with the pain and reduce inflammation," ELENA explained, mixing the willow bark powder with honey and water to create a paste that could be applied directly to James's shoulder wound. "My grandmother used this same recipe to treat everything from headaches to bullet wounds." James watched ELENA work, noting how her movements carried the fluid confidence of someone completely comfortable with traditional healing methods. 3 days had passed since their firefight with Blackwood's mercenaries, 3 days of hiding in their mountain sanctuary while the blizzard raged outside, and their wounds began the slow process of healing. "Your grandmother treated bullet wounds?" James asked, accepting the cup of medicinal tea ELENA offered along with the topical treatment. "Vietnam era. Cherokee men served in disproportionate numbers, and when they came home wounded, military hospitals weren't always available or trusted." ELENA settled beside James on the bed of pine boughs and blankets they'd constructed in the cave's warmest corner. She learned field medicine from necessity, same as everything else. The herbal treatment burned slightly as ELENA applied it to James's shoulder, but the pain was followed by a soothing coolness that suggested the medicine was working exactly as intended. James marveled at how ELENA's knowledge seemed to encompass every aspect of wilderness survival, from tactical planning to emergency medicine to the kind of botanical expertise that could mean the difference between healing and infection. "Tell me about going back," ELENA said quietly, checking the bandage that covered the shrapnel cut across her cheek. "When the storm ends and we climb down from these mountains, what happens then?" James considered the question seriously, understanding that ELENA was asking about more than just tactical planning. She was asking whether their relationship could survive the transition from wilderness sanctuary to civilized world, whether what they'd built together in the mountains would prove strong enough to withstand the pressures of normal life. "First, we get the evidence to the FBI and the Environmental Protection Agency. The documentation I gathered will trigger criminal investigations that could take years to resolve." James reached for ELENA's hand, intertwining their fingers with the automatic intimacy that had developed during weeks of shared danger. "But that's the easy part. And the hard part? Learning how to live together in a world where survival doesn't depend on trusting each other completely." James's thumb traced the back of ELENA's hand, noting the calluses that marked her as someone who'd worked with her hands her entire life. "Everything between us happened under extreme circumstances. We need to find out if it translates to ordinary daily life." ELENA was quiet for a moment, considering the challenges that awaited them beyond the mountains. Her entire adult identity had been built around isolation and self-sufficiency, around the deliberate rejection of social connections that could be used against her by people with power and resources. "I've been alone for 7 years," ELENA said finally. "I'm not sure I remember how to live with another person, how to compromise and negotiate and trust someone with the ordinary details of daily life. Then we learned together. No pressure, No expectations beyond figuring it out as we go. James shifted position to face ELENA more fully, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his shoulder wound. But I'm not walking away from this, from us, just because it might be complicated. ELENA's smile was the first genuinely happy expression James had seen from her since the mercenaries had invaded their sanctuary. You realize that dating me is going to be problematic? I don't exactly fit into corporate social circles. Good thing I'm done with corporate social circles. Turns out I prefer the company of dangerous mountain women who can outshoot professional soldiers and make medicine from tree bark. James leaned closer, careful not to aggravate either of their wounds. Besides, I have a feeling you'll adapt to civilization faster than you think. What makes you so confident? Because you survived 7 years alone in some of the most challenging terrain in North America. Learning to navigate city life should be relatively simple by comparison. James kissed her softly, tasting the herbs she'd been using to treat her own wounds. And because you'll have help this time. ELENA returned the kiss with growing intensity, her hands tangling in his hair, as weeks of carefully controlled attraction finally found full expression. Outside their shelter, the storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, but inside the warm cave, they had everything they needed to heal both their bodies and their hearts. The legal documents lay spread across a fallen log, like evidence of corporate crimes waiting to be judged. Their waterproof envelope protecting 3 years of painstaking investigation that could destroy Blackwood Industries forever. James arranged the papers methodically, ensuring each piece of evidence was properly organized for the legal battle that would determine whether environmental criminals faced justice or continued poisoning watersheds across 7 states. ELENA watched him work with the same focused intensity she'd observed during their wilderness training, noting how his corporate background allowed him to navigate complex legal documentation with practiced efficiency. The storm had finally broken during the night, leaving the mountain landscape transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow that glittered like diamonds in the morning sunlight. 67 executives could face criminal charges, James explained, pointing to organizational charts that mapped the corporate conspiracy from middle management to the board of directors, including Richard Blackwood himself, who personally approved illegal dumping operations that poisoned reservation water supplies and killed endangered fish populations. How long will it take? ELENA asked, studying photographs that documented environmental destruction across multiple states. Years. The legal system moves slowly when you're challenging corporations with unlimited resources and political connections. James gathered the most damaging evidence into a separate pile, documents that would form the core of federal criminal charges. But once this evidence becomes public, they can't make it disappear or discredit it through character assassination. ELENA understood the magnitude of what James was proposing. Walking down from the mountains meant abandoning the sanctuary she'd built over 7 years, trading wilderness safety for the uncertainties of legal proceedings that could drag on indefinitely. It meant trusting institutions that had failed her family completely, when corporate criminals had destroyed her parents' lives. What about us? ELENA asked, the question carrying weight beyond mere logistics. Where do we live while all this is happening? How we build a life together when you'll be spending months in courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms? James looked up from the legal documents, recognizing the vulnerability beneath ELENA's practical concerns. There's a cabin for sale in the valley, about 10 miles from town. 40 acres, mostly wooded, with a stream that runs year-round. It's not as isolated as your mountain sanctuary, but it's private enough for someone who values independence. The description stirred something in ELENA's chest, a possibility she hadn't allowed herself to consider during 7 years of deliberate isolation. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about everything, about how we met, about what we've survived together, about what comes next. James set aside the legal papers and moved closer to ELENA, noting how the morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair. I want to build something with you, ELENA. Not just survive together, but actually build a life that makes sense for both of us. ELENA was quiet for a long moment, studying the valley spread below their mountain sanctuary. Somewhere down there, beyond the snow-covered forest and frozen streams, waited a world of complications and compromises she'd spent 7 years avoiding, but also a world where environmental criminals could be brought to justice and watersheds could be protected for future generations. "The cabin you mentioned," Elena said finally. "Does it have good defensive positions?" James smiled, recognizing Elena's practical approach to evaluating any living situation. "High ground, clear fields of fire, multiple escape routes through surrounding forests." The previous owner was apparently a veteran who understood the value of tactical positioning. "And water rights? Stream runs through the middle of the property. Legal water rights dating back to territorial days can't be challenged by development or municipal demand." James had clearly researched every detail that might matter to someone accustomed to complete self-sufficiency. "There's also a workshop suitable for traditional crafts, and enough cleared land for a substantial garden." Elena felt the last of her resistance crumbling as James described a life that could bridge the gap between her mountain independence and the necessities of engaging with civilization. "You really think we can make this work?" "I think we can make work if we're committed to figuring it out together." James reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed during weeks of shared survival. "But it has to be your choice, Elena. I won't ask you to give up everything you've built here, unless you're certain it's what you want." Elena looked one last time at the mountain sanctuary that had protected her for 7 years, then back at James with decision crystallizing in her dark eyes. "My grandmother used to say that the greatest courage isn't facing death, it's choosing to live fully despite knowing how much life can hurt. And what's your choice?" Elena's smile carried the same fierce determination that had helped her survive alone in the wilderness for 7 years. "I choose to live fully, with you in that valley cabin, fighting corporate criminals and building something worth protecting." James kissed her then, soft and certain, sealing a decision that would transform both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The wedding ring Elena had crafted from mountain stone caught the afternoon sunlight as she tended their vegetable garden, its surface polished smooth by 6 months of wear and daily use. She'd carved it from granite taken from the sacred cairn where James had first told her he loved her, shaping the hard stone into a symbol of unbreakable commitment forged in the crucible of wilderness survival. James emerged from their valley cabin, carrying the satellite phone that had become their primary connection to the legal proceedings, grinding forward in Washington, D.C. His expression carried the satisfaction of someone who'd received long-awaited news, though Elena could see the exhaustion that months of testimony and depositions had etched around his eyes. "Guilty verdicts on all counts," James announced, settling beside Elena among the tomato plants that grew with surprising vigor in the mountain valley's rich soil. "Richard Blackwood got 25 years in federal prison, and the company's been ordered to pay $14 billion in environmental restoration costs." Elena looked up from the herbs she'd been harvesting, noting how James's corporate polish had been replaced by the confident bearing of someone who'd learned to find satisfaction in physical work and simple pleasures. "Your grandfather would be proud. All those letters you never opened. I think he knew you'd eventually find your way to something that mattered." The cabin behind them bore evidence of the life they'd built together over the past 6 months. Elena's traditional crafts shared space with James's legal books, while her hunting rifle hung beside his expensive suit jackets that now served primarily as courtroom costumes. The blend of mountain independence and civilized necessity had proven surprisingly harmonious. Elena Redhawk's wilderness skills, James read from the business cards that had arrived in the morning mail. Mountain survival training for corporate executives who want to reconnect with the natural world. Elena smiled as she examined the professional printing that transformed her hard-earned knowledge into a legitimate business venture. Funny how corporate executives are suddenly interested in learning skills their grandfathers took for granted. Not funny at all. People are realizing that urban life has disconnected them from basic survival capabilities. James helped Elena gather the herbs they'd use for the evening meal, noting how his hands had developed calluses that matched her own. "Your waiting list already includes 3 Fortune 500 CEOs and a Supreme Court justice. The transformation in both their lives had been gradual but profound. ELENA's reputation as the mountain woman who defeated professional mercenaries had attracted clients seeking more than wilderness skills. They wanted to learn the kind of self-reliance and mental toughness that enabled someone to thrive independently. James's legal victory against Blackwood Industries had established him as the leading expert on corporate environmental crime, resulting in consulting contracts that paid well while serving justice. "There's something else," James said, reaching into his jacket pocket with the careful movements of someone handling something precious. The adoption papers came through. David and Sarah Torres officially have a new stepfather as of this morning. ELENA felt tears gathering in her eyes as she studied the legal documents that formally recognized James's relationship with Jenny's children. David had spent the summer working on their land, learning traditional skills while helping James establish the sustainable farming practices that were turning their 40 acres into a model of environmental stewardship. "They chose you," ELENA said quietly, extolling the significance of teenagers accepting an adult who'd entered their lives through extraordinary circumstances. "That means more than any legal document. They chose both of us." David told his mother that learning mountain skills from ELENA was like having a grandmother who could outshoot Delta Force operators. James's laugh carried genuine affection for the boy who'd become as close as a son during months of shared work. "Sarah wants to spend next summer here too, learning traditional healing methods for her pre-med studies." ELENA placed her hand over her still flat stomach, feeling the early flutter of movement that confirmed what she'd suspected for the past few weeks. "They're going to have competition for our attention soon." James stared at her for a moment, understanding dawning in his expression like sunrise over mountain peaks. "ELENA, are you saying—" "I'm saying that some fears are worth tasting because they lead to the sweetest victories." ELENA's smile carried the fierce joy of someone who'd chosen to embrace life fully, despite understanding its potential for heartbreak. "Our child will grow up knowing both worlds, mountain wisdom and civilized knowledge, traditional skills and modern education." James kissed her then, tasting salt from tears of happiness that mixed with the mountain air they both breathed freely. In the distance, their mountain sanctuary remained visible against the horizon, a reminder of where their love had been forged and the wilderness that would always call to their hearts. "Welcome to the rest of our lives," ELENA whispered against his lips, her hand resting on the promise of their future growing inside her.